There's a photograph that shouldn't exist. It was taken in the early 1900s, in a quiet town most maps today wouldn't even mark. The image shows a family that appears ordinary at first glance, posed stiffly in front of a weathered farmhouse. But if you look closely, there's something about their eyes, the subtle asymmetry of their faces, the way their smiles don't quite meet the gaze. It all feels wrong. For generations, this family kept to themselves, and not by accident. They had rules, old rules, whispered about in the shadows of church pews and across kitchen tables, rules that no outsider could break, and rules that ensured their bloodline remained untouched by the outside world. Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment with where you're from, and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Historians, when they finally stumbled across this family's records decades later, could hardly believe what they were seeing. Marriage certificates dating back hundreds of years revealed patterns so deliberate, so precise, that they could only have been intentional. Cousins marrying cousins. Siblings, in some cases, quietly joined in unions no one dared speak of. Their goal was simple on the surface: purity. They wanted their family to remain untainted. But the consequences of such strict, unbroken control would ripple through the generations in ways even they could not anticipate. For decades, the town surrounding this family whispered about strange habits, sudden disappearances, and children who looked different. The town's residents were polite, fearful even, but they knew better than to ask questions. The family's wealth and influence kept most curious minds at bay, and the locals learned early: silence was safer than inquiry. The children were never allowed to speak of family matters outside the walls of their home, and any who dared break this silence faced swift punishment. It was a psychological prison, invisible yet absolute, and it worked. For over a century, the family's secrets remained buried, locked away in the quiet corners of attics, in faded letters no one dared read, and in photographs that seemed to freeze the past in a way that was almost unnatural. But silence, as history often shows, is never permanent. And for this family, one moment, one photograph, one curious mind, would be all it took for the carefully constructed illusion to begin unraveling. The earliest records of this family date back to the mid-1800s, in a time when rural isolation could hide the most extraordinary secrets. At first glance, they were an ordinary farming family, but genealogists later noticed a pattern that made their findings almost impossible to believe. Every generation married within the same small circle, often between first or second cousins. There were even whispers, never officially confirmed, of siblings quietly joining in these unions. Their reason, according to surviving letters and journals, was simple: purity. They believed that mixing with outsiders would dilute the strength of their lineage, and that maintaining strict bloodlines was both a duty and a safeguard for their legacy. What makes this story so haunting isn't just the methodical record of these unions. It's what emerged when the family began to withdraw from the world entirely. Children were isolated almost from birth, raised in near-complete silence, forbidden to interact freely with anyone outside the home. They were educated only in ways that served the family's long-term goals: letters, arithmetic, religious study, but no exposure to the outside culture. Their social development was stunted, their behaviors often unsettling, and yet, they were shielded from the scrutiny of outsiders. To anyone in town, they appeared polite, quiet, almost ghost-like. To those who knew better, they were something darker, a living experiment carried out over decades, with generations of children as its subjects. Medical historians who later examined skeletal remains and photographs of the family noted deformities that could only have resulted from extreme inbreeding: crooked spines, unusually large foreheads, asymmetrical facial structures, and other subtle but unmistakable anomalies. But what was more chilling than the physical evidence was the psychological impact. Letters recovered in the late 20th century reveal a household rife with paranoia, fear, and rigid control. One recurring phrase found in the journals reads, "The line must remain pure, even if the cost is silence." And the cost, as it turned out, was immeasurable. By the time the 20th century rolled in, the family had become nearly mythical in the surrounding counties. Some neighbors told tales of children wandering the property late at night, speaking in low, whispering voices, their eyes wide and unblinking. Others swore they could hear the faint echo of a piano, or the scratching of pen on paper, hours after the last candle had been extinguished. The family, it seemed, was living in two worlds, one visible to the public, polite and controlled, the other hidden, filled with secrets so dark they would shock anyone who dared to uncover them. The turning point came in the 1950s. By then, the family had maintained its isolation for over a century, and most of the local town had accepted their silence as normal. But one summer, a relative who had been sent away to college returned home. Unlike the others, she had been exposed to the outside world, to ideas and freedoms that had never touched her family's estate. And unlike her ancestors, she began to question the rules that had bound her relatives for generations. She noticed the children first. They were pale, quiet, and obedient to an eerie degree, with faces that carried the weight of unspoken torment. Their eyes, unnervingly alert, seemed to record everything around them, yet they never spoke of what they had seen or experienced. She tried to teach them games, simple pleasures, but every attempt was met with a mixture of fear and confusion. They had been trained from birth that normal interactions could be dangerous, that the outside world was corrupting. Every smile was hesitant, every laugh forced. In her journal, later discovered in a forgotten drawer, she wrote, "They are children of shadows, walking through a life they were never meant to understand." It was during this summer that she discovered the hidden diaries of her ancestors. Bound in cracked leather, the pages detailed a chilling doctrine: control, isolation, and the deliberate preservation of the family's bloodline. Every generation had been manipulated and groomed according to a rigid set of rules, with punishments so severe they left permanent scars, both visible and invisible. Some passages describe the removal of children who disobeyed the rules, sent to distant relatives, or simply vanished without explanation. The tone of the writing is clinical, detached, as if the authors were scientists documenting an experiment rather than parents raising a family. Family's obsession with secrecy had reached a point where even the adults were unable to form normal bonds with each other. Love, affection, and trust were commodities so rare they became myths within the household. Family members slept in separate rooms, dined alone, and communicated only through formal, almost ritualistic exchanges. Visitors were rare and watched carefully, and any attempt to pry into the family's affairs was met with cold, deliberate silence. It was this returning relative who first began to question the morality of it all, daring to imagine a life beyond the estate, beyond the suffocating rules. But questioning was dangerous. The family had long memories, and any rebellion, no matter how minor, was met with swift retribution. Still, her curiosity marked the first crack in a chain of silence that had lasted for over a century, a crack that would eventually grow into a chasm. The first real break in the silence occurred one cold winter evening in 1963. The town had experienced an unusually harsh season, and the family's isolation was compounded by weather and geography. A neighbor, curious about the strange patterns of lights and shadows from the estate, decided to peek through the window. What they saw would haunt them for the rest of their lives. A gathering of children, sitting silently in a circle, chanting passages from old family scripts, their faces expressionless, almost as if the words themselves were alive. Authorities were never called, and the neighbor dared not speak of it. But the incident became the first spark of rumor that spread quietly through the town. Children disappeared from local schools without explanation, or returned weeks later, withdrawn and hollow-eyed. And yet, the family continued their lives outwardly unchanged. They went to church, attended town meetings, and maintained a polite, distant facade. Outside observers could not reconcile the polite veneer with the reports of something deeply disturbing occurring behind closed doors. During this time, medical examinations and genealogical studies began to reveal the genetic toll of over a century of insular relationships. Children were born with deformities, some subtle, others far more pronounced, and mental health issues were rampant. The journals hinted at attempts to correct behavior and appearance through strict regimens, harsh punishments, and even surgical interventions in some cases. But the family's obsession with purity overrode morality. The line had to remain unbroken, no matter the cost to body or mind. By the late 1960s, a handful of daring locals began to document the family in secret. Photographs, letters, and eyewitness accounts created a patchwork record of a household frozen in time, yet rotting from within. Scholars who later reviewed these records were struck not only by the physical deformities, but by the psychological conditioning evident in the children. The family had engineered obedience, silence, and fear to perfection, creating a generation that could survive but not truly live. And yet, the breaking point was approaching. One small act, one brave question, one accidental discovery would unravel the decades of control. For a family so meticulous in their secrecy, the world outside was closing in faster than they ever anticipated. By the 1970s, the story begins to shift from whispered rumors to undeniable revelation. A distant cousin, sent away to a nearby city for education, returned with notebooks, photographs, and testimonies from those who had escaped the estate. They began piecing together the family's long history, uncovering records that were meant to remain hidden. Letters detailing marriages between immediate family members, medical records highlighting the results of centuries of inbreeding, and diaries documenting punishments inflicted for the slightest deviation. All of it painted a picture of a household both horrifying and methodical. The cousin shared these findings with a trusted friend outside the family, and in doing so, they broke the first rule, the silence. Once the information left the walls of the estate, the family's control began to crumble. Children who had never known freedom began to speak in hushed tones. Adults, conditioned to obedience, were forced to confront the reality that their secrets could no longer remain buried. The world outside the estate had finally begun to infiltrate the shadows. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? Could you stay silent, or would you risk everything for truth? It's a question that haunted every surviving member of the family, and one that continues to disturb historians and genealogists who study the case today. The revelations sparked legal investigations, though few records survived to confirm the outcomes. Some family members were placed under guardianship, while others vanished, either by choice or by design. The town, which had quietly observed the family's strange behavior for generations, finally had evidence to understand the whispers. But even then, much of the truth remained obscured by time, loss, and fear. The silence had been broken, yes, but the scars, physical, emotional, psychological, persisted. The aftermath of the family's exposure was both public and private. Researchers visiting the estate described a house frozen in time, with rooms that seemed untouched for decades. Personal belongings, diaries, photographs, and ritualistic artifacts lined shelves and drawers. The walls themselves seemed to whisper, carrying the weight of generations of secrets, discipline, and fear. Each room revealed a fragment of a life built on control and the obsessive pursuit of bloodline purity. Psychologists analyzing the descendants found patterns of trauma that could be traced directly to the isolation and rigid control imposed over centuries. Many were unable to form healthy relationships, struggled with identity, and carried an almost tangible fear of the outside world. Some family members refused to leave the estate even after the rules had been lifted, their entire existence bound to the legacy of silence. Others fled, desperate to sever ties, yet found the psychological imprint of centuries of conditioning impossible to escape. Historians studying the family's records also noted that the obsession with purity had broader social implications. The family wielded influence over local politics, church appointments, and economic decisions, all to preserve their isolation. They used their wealth and position to enforce silence in the town, ensuring that any curiosity about the family was met with polite denial or veiled threats. What we see here is not just a single family's obsession, but an intricate system of power built on secrecy and fear. Even today, descendants and locals speak of the family with a mixture of reverence, fear, and disbelief. The estate itself remains a site of fascination for those drawn to the dark corners of history. Visitors report feelings of unease, hearing faint echoes of children's voices, or glimpsing shadows that seem almost human. It's as if the house itself remembers the centuries of control and oppression, keeping the memory alive for anyone who dares to look. What remains of this story today is both fragile and haunting. A few descendants live quietly, attempting to lead normal lives, while the house sits abandoned, a monument to the dark obsession with purity and control. The town has largely moved on, yet the whispers persist, a reminder of the generations who lived under fear and silence. Scholars continue to study photographs, letters, and skeletal remains, piecing together the unimaginable reality of a family who maintained their isolation and control for more than a century. The lessons of this family are clear yet disturbing. They show us the dangers of obsession, the cost of secrecy, and the resilience of human curiosity. One photograph, one letter, or one brave question can pierce the thickest veil of silence. The story challenges our notions of family, morality, and what it truly means to survive. And perhaps most hauntingly, it reminds us that even when the truth is buried, it has a way of resurfacing, demanding acknowledgement, and leaving a mark that can never be erased. So, when you think about the quiet corners of towns, the houses that no one visits, the families who seem different, remember this story. Remember that silence can hide more than words. It can hide generations of secrets, carefully guarded, until the moment comes when someone finally dares to speak. And when that moment arrives, the world will see the truth, harsh, unflinching, and unforgettable.